aliens, alien beings Dorothy claimed to communicate with, told her cataclysmic flood came on December 21st.
The deadline approached, the seekers continued their preparations. Dorothy insisted that everyone needed to discard all metal they had with them. Without giving many specifics, she said the metal would superheat when brought aboard the UFO.
So her devotees cut all the metal out of their clothes. Metal zippers, clasps, and buttons all had to go. Time was of the essence since the ship could arrive at any minute. As such, the seekers' clothes often looked strange, full of patchwork and odd holes. But still, the ships didn't arrive. What came instead was much more earthly, but no less dangerous: the press.
On December 16th, reporters gathered outside of Dorothy's Oak Park home. While Charles Lawhead's efforts to gain attention for the group had utterly failed in the past, he finally brought them calling.
After he was fired from Michigan State College, word had slowly spread about his bizarre beliefs. It was a salacious story, especially with the apocalypse supposedly only 5 days away.
The headlines wrote themselves. A university physician had been let go for getting involved with a doomsday cult outside of Chicago.
But now that it was here, Charles no longer wanted the attention. Neither he nor Dorothy trusted the journalists.
They both assumed the media only wanted to exploit them. They didn't really care about helping to save others from a catastrophic flood.
But as the media interest increased, locals were also drawn to the spectacle. Many neighbors who had only heard Dorothy's claims in passing were suddenly interested in learning more.
By the 17th, the phone was ringing nonstop, and people were constantly knocking at Dorothy's front door. The seekers answered as best they could, but people were rarely allowed inside.
Dorothy was still afraid the police would come after her. All the attention proved overwhelming. She hoped true believers would find her, but sussing out them from the enterprising journalists seemed impossible.
It didn't help that some people were only looking to play a joke on the 54-year-old. Local teenagers showed up making false claims about the Guardians that Dorothy briefly considered. She was so desperate for information that she believed almost anything.
In the late morning of December 17th, while the seekers sat in Dorothy's house, the phone rang once again. Despite the incessant calls from nosy journalists, Dorothy decided to answer anyway. On the other end of the line, a young voice introduced himself as Captain Video, which was the name of a sci-fi television character.
In a steady voice, Captain Video told Dorothy that the seekers should come out to the backyard at 4
AC/DC
o'clock.
never had a single top
Then
20
he
hit in
hung up.
America.
Dorothy didn't realize that Captain Video was probably just a neighborhood boy looking for a laugh. Instead, she thought he was one of the Guardians. She immediately told the seekers what she'd just learned.
Anyone who hadn't already eliminated the metal from their clothing hurriedly cut it out. That afternoon, Dorothy checked the window to search the skies for a spacecraft. She was like an overexcited child on Christmas Eve.
Just before 4 p.m., Dorothy and her followers went outside, bundled in jackets to counter the bitter winter breeze.
But when the time finally came, nothing happened.
Instead of seeing that moment as another failure, though, Dorothy deemed the entire thing to be a drill. It was all a test to make sure they were prepared.
Sananda confirmed Dorothy's speculation later that night when he gave her another message. When she informed her followers, they took her word as gospel.
For the researchers from the University of Minnesota, these events were illuminating. During the course of their study, they observed behavior that led to the coining of a new psychological term. The lead researcher, Leon Festinger, later called it cognitive dissonance, and it's gone on to be one of the biggest psychological breakthroughs of the 20th century. Dr. Leon Festinger theorized that when someone is confronted with something that stands in direct opposition to their beliefs, they become psychologically uncomfortable. To alleviate this discomfort, they may behave in ways that go against what they know to be true, or they might twist information they've received to fit their established narrative. In the case of the seekers, this process occurred in a dramatic fashion every time one of Dorothy's predictions failed. For the seekers, it was easier to justify the failure than to confront the possibility that their belief in Dorothy was misplaced.
That explained why, around midnight on the 17th, the seekers once again gathered outside in the cold when Dorothy told them to expect salvation.
With the temperatures dipping, they tried their best to keep warm. But by 3 a.m., most were feeling frozen and gave up. No one had arrived to save them, and Dorothy was left disappointed again.
This latest failure seemed to flip a switch for her. While she'd been wary of strangers coming to her house before, the next morning she wanted to welcome as many as possible.
Over the next 2 days, the seekers waited patiently for any sign of a UFO. In the meantime, Dorothy proselytized to a growing crowd of curious onlookers.
But with each passing hour, the alleged window for salvation shrank. Some followers likely questioned their beliefs quietly, while others who couldn't face the crushing disappointment doubled down.
On December 20th, 1954, the last day before the apocalypse, the group gathered inside Dorothy Martin's kitchen in Oak Park. The anticipation had built for weeks, and now things reached a fever pitch.
None of the seekers, especially those who had given up their jobs and possessions, liked waiting until the last minute for salvation.
Within a few precious hours until December 21st, they imagined half of the world enveloped by the ocean as Mo rose from the depths of the seafloor.
With another message, Dorothy reassured them. The spacecraft would come right at midnight and take them all aboard. For real this time. She swore she felt more certain than ever before.
As the night came, the men and women sat inside her home, anxiously waiting. By 11:15, the room buzzed with quiet excitement. Most sat around giving measured breaths to ease the tension inside.
All of their eyes were fixed on the clock, counting down ever closer to the end. At 11:59, the second hand began its final rotation. Each second dragged.
Then, at last, the hour and minute hands aligned. Someone looked outside. Nothing. The ground didn't shake, the water didn't rise, and no spaceship hovered above.
At least one person decided to leave the group right then. They could no longer stand the disappointment. Dorothy's messages became meaningless.
Hours passed in darkness. Dorothy began crying. Members of the group argued about the prophecy, trying to reinterpret its details. And still, even when the sun rose, believers remained, clinging to their last hope.
Dorothy, of course, had a new message. She told them the Guardians had decided to spare the Earth for now. They wanted to give the Seekers more time to capture an audience.
After her prophecy failed on the 21st, the press was ravenous for the story. That morning, the phone continued ringing, and reporters came by to interview Dorothy and Charles in person. Dorothy seemed invigorated by the attention and tried to share her extraterrestrial messages with the world.
But by December 23rd, public interest had faded, and the press packed up and left. That was especially disappointing for Dorothy, because the Guardians weren't giving her much time to grow her faithful base. And she had a new prophecy. Now, a flying saucer would come at 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve night.
As the moment approached, the remaining members of the Seekers experienced a gamut of emotions. Dr. Charles Lawhead, the initial driving force behind the Seekers, grasped at straws.
To him, every twist and turn in Dorothy's message made complete sense. He never questioned the past prophecies, even when they turned out to be nothing more than random drills or misdirection.
So when Dorothy told him on Christmas Eve that they needed to go outside to sing carols, he didn't hesitate.
The desperate group gathered outside of Dorothy's home and started caroling. As the cold air turned their faces bright red, like eagle-eyed children looking out for St. Nick's sleigh, they looked up to the heavens and belted out the tunes.
While their minds were no doubt preoccupied with thoughts of aliens and flying saucers, the curious onlookers returned. At first, there wasn't much of a public disturbance, but as the night wore on, the crowd size swelled to nearly 200. Someone called the police.
If nothing happened now, the results would truly be devastating. Yet Dorothy held fast. She and the rest of the Seekers sang like their lives depended on it.
As the night wound down, the crowd slowly dwindled as people went to spend the holidays in peace with their families.
And as gently as falling snow, the truth gradually dawned on Dorothy and the Seekers. The spacecraft wasn't coming. The night fell silent.
In the days afterward, the spell was broken for many of the seekers. Dorothy's words left them disillusioned and confused. The messages that had once filled them with so much hope were now meaningless.
Dorothy's greatest fears were realized. On December 26th, the police called her husband, warning him about a warrant for her arrest. While it's unclear exactly what the warrant was for, it likely amounted to simple public nuisance charges.
While this likely wouldn't have resulted in jail time, Dorothy feared she would be committed to a mental institution. So the group disbanded and she fled to Arizona. It's unclear whether her husband followed.
Even then, Charles Lawhead, her most ardent believer, didn't give up. In the months afterward, without Dorothy's involvement, he continued speaking about the Guardians at UFO conventions.
We don't know how long he held out, but it's not hard to imagine that he, like the others, reconsidered his beliefs eventually.
In January 1956, the research team from the University of Minnesota published their findings in a book called When Prophecy Fails. They recounted Dorothy's story and put forth a theory to explain her group's beliefs and behaviors. The following year, Leon Festinger published a book called A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance, which was informed by his experience with the Seekers. This study would be considered a landmark in the field of psychology.
By that point, Festinger lost touch with most of the group. Every one of Dorothy's followers had looked for something that could shine light on a world that had grown increasingly chaotic, and they placed their hopes in an empty promise, one that, unlike the best Christmas stories, never came true.
As for Dorothy, she found empowerment and meaning. In the time since receiving her first message, she discovered her voice. Despite her failed predictions, she never gave up her belief in her divine gift. At one point, she moved to Peru before returning to the United States to live in Sedona, Arizona.
She started going by Sister Thedra and published several books about her spiritual beliefs. While she didn't have a direct influence on many other groups, her actions laid a foundation for other UFO cults like Fiat Lux in Europe or Heaven's Gate in the United States.
When you put it that way, it's a really, really good point because we're so used to thinking.
Thanks again for tuning into this special holiday episode of Cults. For more information on Dorothy Martin and the Seekers, among the many sources we used, we found When Prophecy Fails by Leon Festinger, Henry Regan, and Stanley Schachter, extremely helpful to our research. We'll be back next Tuesday with a new episode.
You can find all episodes of Cults and all other Spotify originals from Parcast for free on Spotify.
We'll see you next time.
Cults is a Spotify original from Parcast. It is executive produced by Max and Ron Cutler, sound designed by Brendan Hawkins, with production assistance by Ron Shapiro, Trent Williamson, Carly Madden, and Bruce Kitovich. This episode of Cults was written by Robert Tyler Walker, with writing assistance by Terrell Wells, fact-checking by Claire Cronin, and research by Brian Petrus and Chelsea Wood. Cults stars Greg Polson and Vanessa Richardson.
Disney had a gift for storytelling that resonated with audiences. From a puppet who wanted to become a real boy to a mermaid who yearned to be part of the human world, Disney has developed relatable and unforgettable characters. Hi, it's Alistair from Parcast. Join me for Once Upon a Time, a special collection of Parcast episodes celebrating the original Imagineer himself, as well as the origins of Disney's most iconic characters and stories. Follow the Spotify original from Parcast, Once Upon a Time, and catch new episodes Mondays, free and only on Spotify.
It's April 26th, 1865. The country is still reeling from a long civil war that has only just come to an end. And to add salt to the wound, just 12 days earlier, on April 14th, the 16th President of the United States of America, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated. Lincoln's funeral train slowly travels through the night from Albany to Buffalo, New York. Fastened to the engine is a portrait of the president, and around 300 people accompany his body as it makes its 1,654-mile voyage. Another coffin is also on the train, that of his 11-year-old son, Willie, who died of typhoid fever in 1862. Willie has been disinterred so that he can be laid to rest next to his father at the family plot in Springfield, Illinois. Thousands of Americans gather in silence along the railway tracks to watch it pass, grief-stricken and frightened of what will become of their struggling new nation. South of Buffalo, in eastern Virginia, dawn breaks over the Rappahannock River. Bald eagles rustle in their nests high in the canopies of the loblolly pines, overlooking the surrounding wetlands, forests, and grasslands. Black ducks slowly make their way along the riverbank in search of pondweed, insects, and worms to feast on. The calm of early dawn is ruffled by the occasional death rattle, coming from a man lying on a blood-soaked mattress on the porch of Richard H. Garrett's farmhouse. The farmhouse is just outside Port Royal on the south bank of Rappahannock. Garrett and his family have had a long and testing night. How could they have ever predicted that the final throes of a national crisis would play out on the steps of their humble home? Mrs. Garrett and her daughter take turns mopping the brow of the man dying in front of them. Boston Corbett, a sergeant of the Federal Army, also there with other soldiers, listens intently for fear he might miss any final words the man might utter. Moments earlier, Corbett defied a direct order and shot John Wilkes Booth through the back of the neck. John Wilkes Booth, the renowned Shakespearean actor and President Abraham Lincoln's assassin, is paralyzed instantly. As part of a team of federal soldiers, Corbett has spent 12 days hunting Booth. The hunt starts on the night of the assassination. The 72 forts surrounding Washington, D.C. are put on high alert and given instructions to close off the city. The 26,000 soldiers stationed in and around the capital are placed on duty. They surround the city, and telegrams are sent out at the speed of light instructing that Booth and anyone with him is arrested on sight. Yet, he somehow evades capture along with his co-conspirator, David Harold. They follow a pre-planned escape route into southern Maryland. The area is sparsely populated and has very few telegraphs or railroads, making it difficult for the authorities to track them. But in the coming days, the detachment of soldiers pick up their trail. Secretary of State Edwin M. Stanton issues a $100,000 reward, and tips start coming in. They search woods and swamps, but Booth and Harold are hiding at properties owned by sympathizers and co-conspirators. They are heading to Richmond, Virginia, the headquarters of the Confederate resistance. Booth believes on arrival into Richmond, he will receive a hero's welcome. For a time, Booth and Harold waited out in Maryland's woods, ready to cross the Potomac River into Virginia at the first opportunity. As they wait to cross, Booth writes in his journal, "For 6 months we had work to capture it, but our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done. I struck boldly, and not as the papers say. I can never repent it, though we hated to kill." When they cross the Potomac and reach Virginia shores, other sympathizers are there to help on the next leg of the journey. But Union soldiers are in hot pursuit aboard a boat that steams down the river. Interrogating known Confederates along the way, the detachment learns of Booth's whereabouts. They follow the lead and cross the Rappahannock River, finally cornering him and Harold and Garrett's tobacco bar. Everyone is exhausted from the turmoil of the last 12 days and the grueling chase. The soldiers surround the bar, and the order is given for the fugitives to come out. Harold surrenders immediately, but Booth has one last fight left in him. "I prefer to come out and fight," Booth barks back. The soldiers set the barn on fire. Through a crack, Corbett spies Booth stumbling around in the smoke-filled barn, fire blazing around him. The instruction was clear from the onset. Booth is to be captured alive so he can stand trial. For reasons unknown, Corbett raises his pistol and takes aim. He pulls the trigger. Booth collapses and is dragged out of the barn. The mattress is brought onto the porch of the Garrett home, and the president's assassin is placed on it. Unable to move and slowly asphyxiating from the wound to his neck, he asks that his hands be raised to his face so that he can see them. Useless, Booth utters. Useless. The soldiers move in closer, and the Garrett family watches on in silence. There isn't anything anyone can do for him. The sky shifts in color as the death watch begins. As the sun finally crests over the Garrett home, Booth chokes and whispers his final words. Mother, I die for my country. You would think that this is the end of the matter. The man who assassinated Lincoln is dead, and the country can move on and begin to rebuild from a civil war that has torn it apart. For a while, that is exactly what happens. Lincoln is laid to rest alongside his son on May 4th, 1865, at the Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield. Time passes, the grief subsides, and reconstruction efforts become the order of the day. But in 1907, 42 years after the assassination of Lincoln, a lawyer from Texas comes forward and makes shocking claims that will leave many wondering what really happened on April 26, 1865. Finis L. Bates publishes a book containing an explosive deathbed confession from a man claiming to be John Wilkes Booth. There is no doubt it was Booth who killed Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on April 14, 1865, but the book tells a different story of what happened next. It asserts Booth was never at the Garrett farm on that fateful morning. He escaped, fleeing into anonymity. 42 years later, he is ready to confess. According to Bates, Corbett shot one of Booth's co-conspirators. The claims sent shockwaves through America and plunged it back into one of its darkest moments. At the moment of death, people often have an overwhelming need to get their biggest secrets off their chests. From murder, fake identities, illicit affairs, and even government cover-ups, this show dives deep into the world's most explosive deathbed confessions. This is the story of John Wilkes Booth, of the words he allegedly spoke as he lay dying. It's about the assassination of one of the most prominent presidents of the United States of America, and the turmoil and uncertainty that followed. It tells the story of a nation divided and fearful of more war, and of one man's obsession with redirecting the course of American history. It's about the hunt to find him, the discovery of his co-conspirators, and the doubts that continue to plague the last moments of the assassin. And one man's need to confess all before it's too late. I'm Stephanie Hageman, and this is Deathbed Confessions.
This episode of Dictators is sponsored by BetterHelp. Look, there are times when it's hard to keep your brain in problem-solving mode, and you just need someone in your corner, someone to help you work through things. A therapist can help you figure out what's causing you to feel the way you do, and they can help you figure out a solution so you can accomplish your goals, no matter how big or small they are. If you're thinking of giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is a great option. It's convenient, accessible, affordable, and it's entirely online. All you have to do is fill out a short survey, and you'll be matched with a licensed therapist that you can talk with via video, phone, or chat. Plus, you can easily switch therapists at any time. If you want to be a better problem solver, BetterHelp can help you get there. And right now, listeners can get 10% off their first month of therapy at betterhelp.com/parcast. That's betterhelp.com/parcast.
This episode is brought to you by Samsung. Unfold the all-new Galaxy Z Fold 4 and expand your world. With Flex Mode, it stands on its own, so your hand's free to get more done during calls. And with multi-window view, you can use up to 3 apps at the same time. Plus, the edge-to-edge screen allows you to fully immerse yourself in your favorite games and shows. Click the banner to learn more about Galaxy Z Fold 4.
This This episode is brought to you by Eggland's Best. You and your family deserve the best. Eggland's Best. The only eggs with more farm fresh delicious taste, plus superior nutrition, like 6 times more vitamin D, 10 times more vitamin E, and 25% less saturated fat than regular eggs. Now available in many different varieties. Eggland's Best. Better taste, better nutrition, better eggs. Click or tap now for more information and some delicious recipes.
In 1872, Finis L. Bates was a young man on the threshold of adulthood. He studied law and settled in the remote town of Granbury, out on the frontier of Texas. It sits under the Boston Mountains, a wilderness of 38 summits with the Boston River lazily winding through valleys and homesteads. Raids from the Comanche Nation occasionally interrupt the quiet surrounding the conquered area, but mostly it is a place where not much happens. Bates is here cutting his teeth as a young lawyer. He mostly handles land disputes, licensing, and trade agreements for clients. Nothing too exciting. A client of his is being indicted for selling tobacco and whiskey out of Glenrose Mills, a small holding with log houses, living quarters, and a store on the
this.
River.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Only
thought it was.
his
I
client
thought it
doesn't
was.
John St. Helen does. Bates hunts St. Helen down and asks
Oh,
him to
wait,
appear as a
oh,
witness in
this.
federal court on behalf of his client. If he can prove St. Helen owns the property and
Wait,
not
there's
his
a bird.
client, the case will be dismissed.
Did you make the bird? He's like, do you make the bird?
Unexpected
I'd be like,
move.
no.
St. Helen
He's like,
employs
oh,
Bates as his
okay.
lawyer.
Well,
Now, Bates cannot incriminate his new client or insist he appear. And
Brandenburg.
St. Helen's clever move to avoid court has made Bates curious about the man. St. Helen is quiet and soft-mannered. He is eloquent, and to Bates seems too refined for frontier living.
Mikey, you made friends.
St. Helen
I said,
explains
no,
that he
Yoshi.
cannot
Like,
appear in
yeah, you
federal
did.
court.
You said
This only
Ratkus
heightens
and
Bates's
Palm,
curiosity, and along with Bates'
Brandon
lawyer,
Bird,
they strike
Arab
up a friendship with
Atticus,
sorts.
Roy Sallin
He
Jones,
visits St. Helen at
Erskine
Glenrose from time to time.
147. You're like,
And
oh,
St.
no, I
Helen
know
drops
enough
to
about
Bates'
this
office
stuff.
in town.
Those are your
They
friends,
talk
Mikey.
about this and
Yeah,
that.
he's like,
St.
before I
Helen
lost you,
arranges chasing
I
them
used
out.
to show.
It is one of his favorite pastimes.
Really? Yeah. Now I'm
Bates
like
never
Pebbles.
asks him about
You're
his
just
true
like, I'm
identity.
like Pebbles.
St. Helen
Really?
never
Yeah.
offers an explanation.
Really? He's like, oh, yeah, you see what you got going on.
5 years pass and St. Helen is struck down with a terrible disease. He
From where
takes
is
to his sickbed,
ACDC?
weak, emaciated, and
New
delirious.
South Wales. They're all
Bates is
shut.
woken one night and told
Not
he must
really
rush to
take that into
Glenrose.
account.
St.
Why?
Helen is in the last throes of death. Bates dresses in a hurry, and when he
So
arrives,
how aren't
he
they?
finds the doctor holding St. Helen's wrist
They
and
just
counting
never
his
really made it in
irregular
the United
pulse.
States and on the billboard. They never
St.
had a
Helen
top
is
20
dying,
hit.
the doctor says. He wishes to speak to you.
And ACDC
Bates
never made
approaches the
a
bed
top
and
20
gently
hit. They
asks
have
what
like
he can do for him.
10
His eyes
easily
gently
top
flickering.
20. Number
St.
one
Helen
hits
whispers,
easily. You mean like TNT, Highway to Hell's not going to make fucking number one in the United States if people
"It's
didn't know
John
about
Wilkes Booth, and I am the assassin of President Lincoln. Get the picture of myself from under the pillow. I leave it with you for my future
it? Not
identification.
even the top 20. What the fuck are people
Notify
doing?
my brother Edwin Booth of New York City."
You know, maybe they were streaming that live.
Bates removes the picture from under the
And they're
pillow
like,
and
oh,
nods. He knows
you can
very
only
little
get
about
a
John
record
Wilkes
if
Booth,
you watch
the
on
actor and
YouTube.
assassin of Lincoln. Bates grew up on a quiet
I'm gonna
plantation in
wear
Mississippi.
little boy
He was
shorts and
17 when the president was killed. He never really gave the episode much thought over the course of his young life. Now, he has questions. Questions that only his friend can answer. He looks at St. Helen or John Wilkes Booth and waits for more. St. Helen closes his eyes. Bates cannot tell if
There's
his
a
friend
nice
is in the final
highest
state
of
of
artists
death
in the United States.
or
Never had a
restful
top
one
20.
promising future recovery. He hopes it's the latter.
Not even top 20. Top 10's okay.
How did
Top
Booth,
20.
a young man celebrated across
Like,
America
it's
as one of the
Spider, I
most
think, maybe
gifted
top 20.
actors of his time, become capable of such a bold act of violence? Journalists and people who knew him would seek to answer that question in the days after Lincoln's assassination. Many still ask that same question today, with every explanation offered seeming to fall short. It is inexplicable to most people, but when you look closely at the trajectory of Booth's life, it is possible to see the traces of events, relationships, and circumstances that together rouse a desire in Booth to stand at the crossroads of American history and direct its course. Booth is born on May 10, 1838, to Mary Ann and Junius Booth in Maryland. Maryland.
Somebody's gonna be like,
He's raised under the rolling hills of Hartford County in 15 acres of wilderness, just outside the village of Bel Air. Marianne, having lost a number of her children in the 1833 cholera outbreak, smothers Booth with love and affection.
how you living?
His father, Junius, an immigrant from England, is a well-regarded stage actor. In America, Junius is considered one of the best actors of his era. At home, he counsels his children to never resort to violence, admonishing them for even killing a fly, and makes a personal choice to abstain from eating meat because of the cruelty inflicted
My
on
friend,
animals.
would be like, are you
He also refuses to own enslaved people
He'd be like,
and welcomes anyone who crosses his threshold with warmth and hospitality. Raised with love and strong moral guidance, it is difficult to fathom how Booth would one day, so violently and publicly, take the life of one of the most influential presidents in the history of the United States.
why?
But Booth's descent into violence started when he was a young boy. Unbeknown to
I went to
others,
Carter Feldman.
his parents are harboring a secret. He and Mary are not legally married. They elope to America with Junius leaving a wife and children behind in England. When his legal wife hears of Junius's success and wealth as a stage actor in America, she tracks him down in Maryland and petitions the court for a divorce. The scandal brings shame and stigma to a widely respected man and family name. Importantly, it challenges Booth's legitimacy as a descendant of that family. Booth carries the stigma on his shoulders. He pledges to restore his family's honor and takes up a career in stage acting. The young Booth has something to prove. When his father suddenly dies in 1852, Booth, at the tender age of 14, leaves the strict military boarding school
This
that he's
thing's
been
pretty
attending
fucking unreal.
and returns home to his mother. He steps into his father's shoes, intending to become the man
Alright,
of the
so
household.
let's go at this like J-Bomb.
Around him, the
Wait,
world is
J-Bomb,
slowly
how's
falling
this gonna work?
apart.
Too good. Well,
Slavery is polarizing the country, dividing it between North,
you did it last
pro-abolitionist
night,
states,
right?
and South,
Yeah, it worked for like a
pro-slavery
couple
states.
hours, and then it's like, and then what
Wedged
happened?
between the North
I
and
don't.
South, Maryland is the
Then the
only
program
line state
stopped.
where those two opposing
He's like,
sides collide.
oh, well, how do you know that's not
Both
gonna
the
happen this time?
abolitionists and supporters
well,
of slavery are
this
treated
time I
with
shut down the whole
suspicion
program,
and mistrust.
and then we started.
A
So
new
if the program
political view
shuts
comes to
down,
prevail over the state.
basically the only thing that's gonna fuck me now is that thing that says
Nativist movement
your
that
battery
rejects
is running low.
immigration
Like
and
that will
peddles
fuck
fear
me.
of
So it's not
outsiders
perfect. He's like,
and foreign influence.
all right, well, get back to me when the
Despite
fucking
being
thing
a
is
child
done.
of
I don't even know how to
immigrants,
shut that thing off. I think it
Booth
has
is
to do with
swept
like
up
the
in the
duct tape
social
belt and
tensions of the time.
AC adapter.
He attends no
I'm
nothing
not
rallies
sure.
in
It
his
has to do
history.
with the battery and like
Those early
lithium.
forays into political
I don't know.
activism would
And
become
be like,
more and
okay,
more extreme, so
well,
that eventually
I mean, it looks good.
violence and even
Is it
murder
done?
are justified.
So,
For a
oh, no
long
shit.
while, Booth keeps any political opinions he has to himself and concentrates on establishing his stage career. He works as a stock actor for many years, a brutal craft that requires mastering a specific character archetype, a villain, gentleman, or hero. It involves memorizing the lines of that archetype character across a huge number of plays so that he can perform it in play at short notice, anywhere and anytime. It is how actors cut their teeth in the world of 19th century entertainment. In 1855, he catches a break and is cast as Richmond in Richard III. His star begins to rise. Audiences love him, theater companies find him easy to work with, and his peers and critics believe him to be a gifted actor. Women flock to his dressing room, keen to have a moment with the handsome athletic actor with wavy hair and dark broody eyes that is taking the country by storm. But in 1859, Booth once again becomes involved in the political struggle of his time. John Brown, a leader of a group of abolitionists, is captured in Virginia and found guilty of murder, inciting slaves to insurrection and treason. His punishment is death by
Was it
hanging.
one of those copy machines where you put quarters in?
2 weeks before
Like a
his
Xerox
scheduled
machine?
hanging, the governor
Was it
of Virginia
Kyocera?
sounds the warning that abolitionists
Kyocera
are heading
copier?
for Charleston,
I like
where
Kyocera.
Brown is being held,
I didn't
to
have
break him out of jail. He calls for militia groups
Was
to
it
gather
Canon?
and prevent Brown's rescue.
Canon.
Outraged, Booth decides it is high time to get involved. Though not a member of any militia group, he takes the train to Charlestown, ready to participate in ensuring justice is done. And Brown hangs,
My friend
but
Yosh,
the rescue attempt never materializes.
I think.
Booth stays on in Charlestown to watch
He was
Brown's
like, "Are you
execution.
And I
As he
was like,
watches the man hang, Booth surprisingly develops respect for him. His bravery in the final moments of life leave a strong impression. Later, he describes Brown as a man inspired and the grandest character of the century. Perhaps a character Booth starts to imagine himself to
There's
be.
this kind of nail polish that my friend's wife really likes.
When Abraham Lincoln is elected president in November 1860, it further polarizes a country already divided. A staunch abolitionist, Lincoln is loved by some and hated by others, and is seen as both tyrant and father figure.
Is this done?
Slavery is the consuming topic of the day. Talk of secession and civil war is on everyone's lips.
I feel like,
For Booth, keeping the Union together is what matters. He blames the abolitionists for
So you have
tearing the nation apart.
like I
Their obsession with slavery and relentless efforts to bring it to an end has caused the crisis the country finds itself in. And if the South chooses to now split, it is because the North, with Lincoln at the helm, leaves it no other option. Booth takes a paternalistic view of slavery, believing both master and slave are happy with the arrangement. He argues Africans live better in America as slaves than they do as free people anywhere else in the world. And in his travels south, they appear happy. Much like the country, his family is divided along the same lines. Those who support Lincoln and abolition, and those who support the South. Booth, showing open support of the South, would break up the Booth family and destroy the legacy he committed to protect when a young boy. Booth hesitates and does not throw himself into the fight. But matters are about to get worse.
Pinocchio, Sleeping Beauty, The Little Mermaid. They're all iconic Disney movies. But did you know the original versions of these stories did not end with a happily ever after? Hi, I'm Alistair from Parcast, and I'm hosting a new Spotify original called Once Upon a Time. For 9 weeks, we're commemorating the 120th anniversary of original Imagineer Walt Disney's birth by lifting the curtain and comparing some of your favorite Disney stories with their earliest tellings. Once Upon a Time will chart Disney's career triumphs, as well as the crushing defeats that almost ruined it all. We'll also look at what it took to bring these stories to life, and why Disney's adapted versions became so memorable across generations. Follow the Spotify original from Parcast, Once Upon a Time. Listen free and exclusively on Spotify.
This episode is brought to you by Poise Ultra Thins. Out of the millions of women who experience bladder leaks, 7 out of 10 women are using their period pads to help stay dry. But listen up, ladies. Period pads aren't designed for pee, and you don't have to settle for subpar protection. With Poise Ultra Thins, you can feel clean, dry, and fresh all day long. Poise Ultra Thins are specifically designed for bladder leaks and keep you 10 times drier than the leading period pad. They're also super comfortable. With a fit made for your body, you'll barely know it's there, so you can live life without compromise. It takes poise. Tap the banner, click on this episode's page, or visit poise.com to learn more.
Lincoln is inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. On April 12th, Confederate units fire on Union soldiers at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, ending a standoff instigated by the state's vote to secede. This act takes the country to war. Booth keeps his head down. But by 1864, the Union is crumbling around him. Booth watches as the South is beaten in battle after battle. He is demoralized by Confederate losses and outraged by Lincoln's hardline approach. The grueling work of acting, endless performances, thousands of miles of travel under harsh conditions, and injuries due to his risky stage performances also begin to take its toll. The women have moved on, and the wealth he accumulated is starting to dry up. He is tired, and the critics are not as kind as they once were. Booth's star is waning. He reaches a crossroads. Does he continue a stage career that is waning, or reinvent himself as a fighting man? The choice he makes will change the course of American history. To reverse the fortunes of the South, a man of honor is needed to step bravely forward and take bold action. The archetypal hero, Such a man will snatch victory from the enemy at the final hour and win the day. In his own imagination, Booth is such a man. He has dedicated his entire life to protecting the legacy of his family name. He is bold, much like John Brown, who years earlier he came to admire for his bravely facing the news. The South has one final fight left in it, and so does Booth. There is no better man for the role. In 1864, Booth steps off stage and enters the theater of war. He is about to play the ultimate lead role in a production of his own making. As the war progresses, Lincoln takes a harder approach. The food supplies of the Confederate Army are intercepted. Houses of suspected rebels are burned to the ground, and the president refuses to exchange prisoners of war. For Booth, this is one barbaric act too many. Southern newspapers report on the inhumane treatment of their prisoners in the North, including abuse, starvation, and Confederate soldiers used as human shields. It puts a strain on the Confederate Army. Booth is seething. He hatches a plan. He intends to abduct President Lincoln and smuggle him across the Potomac River into Richmond in Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. He believes once the president is in the hands of the Confederate government, the Federal Army will have no choice but to agree to a prisoner exchange. The President of the United States for Confederate Army soldiers held in northern prisons. This will either embolden the Confederacy to victory or force the North to recognize its government. Booth knows Lincoln makes frequent trips to his cottage on the grounds of Soldiers' Home just outside Washington, and he often makes those trips alone along isolated rural roads. Booth's plot involves a group of men overtaking the president's carriage, placing him in handcuffs, and then transporting him through southern Maryland and into Richmond. But to execute such a plan, Booth needs a group of men, and he needs secure passage into Richmond. He dedicates most of 1864 to recruiting co-conspirators and mapping the route. Acting is a distant memory, and a far bigger drama is about to unfold. By January 1864, Booth's abduction plan is more than just a fantasy that he plays out in his head. He recruits David Harold, a pharmacy clerk. He convinces associates Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin to act as muscle for the abduction. Thomas Harbin and John Surratt join the plot and are tasked with securing Booth's passage into Richmond with the president in shackled custody. George Atzerodt and Lewis Powell also sign up to the plot. He keeps his co-conspirators in separate groups. They are unknown to each other, with each group only aware of its particular mission in the plot. Later that month, Booth suddenly changes his plans. He learns that Lincoln no longer makes solo trips to the soldier's house. Higher security measures have been placed around the president's movement because of fears for his safety. Booth takes it in his stride. He settles on a new location that he knows the president frequents, Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. But the new plan spooks his co-conspirators. The isolated location of the original abduction place is crucial to the plot. To abduct the President of the United States while he is in public view is bold, perhaps too bold to stand a chance of success. Booth's co-conspirators start to doubt him. To make matters worse, his family and friends are growing increasingly concerned about his state of mind. They have noticed changes in Booth's manner that make them wonder what is going on. He no longer shows any interest in his acting career, and his once chronic optimism has faded. They try to entice him back to the stage and write him letters expressing concerns over his idleness and how he has become distracted and short-tempered. Booth takes no notice. He continues in his plot, assuring his co-conspirators of success and finessing the details. He builds cover stories with his co-conspirators, gathers evidence of their involvement behind their backs so that if any one of them decides to quit, he can blackmail them with exposure. He takes his co-conspirators to Ford's Theater to watch a play. It is nothing more than a recce visit designed to allow those involved to get to know the theater layout and location of the abduction. But his co-conspirators still have concerns, and when news that prisoner exchanges had already resumed begins to spread, some argue the plot should be abandoned entirely. The objective was to abduct the president in order to force the issue of prisoner exchanges. If that is no longer strangling the Confederate struggle, what purpose would the abduction now serve? The abduction in public view also plays on their minds. It seems an impossible task, with some arguing even if they managed to abduct Lincoln, there is no way they would get him out of Ford's Theater, let alone to Richmond. These doubts weaken the resolve of the co-conspirators and their conviction of Booth. Booth reaches an impasse with his co-conspirators. Some argue that he does not intend to abduct the president and is refusing to explain his real intention. The plan is too audacious. Perhaps Booth actually intends to assassinate Lincoln. That's a plot they never signed up for. His co-conspirator Arnold, who will act as muscle in the abduction, tells him, "You can be the leader of the party, but not my executioner." But Booth is a master of persuasion and convinces them to continue on. They've all traveled too far down the road of conspiracy to give up now. They must soldier forward with bravery and carry on with the plan. In case any doubt continues to linger, he entraps them further by staging a fake abduction attempt that implicates them all in the act of treason. On the morning of April 10th, 1865, newspapers run the headline, "Surrender of Lee and his whole army. Grant terms accepted. Richmond, the seat of the failed Confederate government, has fallen. The Confederate army has laid down its arms and admitted defeat. For all intents and purposes, the war is over and the North is the victor." Booth is despondent. The opportunity to redirect the course of the war and bring victory to the South has passed. His plot to abduct the president has lost its purpose. Booth meets one of his co-conspirators after taking out his anger at a shooting range on Pennsylvania Avenue. It all seems lost, and so his co-conspirator asks Booth why he isn't acting. Angry, Booth explains he is finished with the stage, and the only play he is interested in now is Venice Preserved. His co-conspirator doesn't realize that Venice Preserved is a play about a plot to assassinate the leaders of Venice. The abduction plot may have come to an end, but for Booth, assassinating the president is an increasingly attractive alternative. He spends the next few days wandering the streets, stopping at places he often frequents, and speaking briefly with associates. He's a lost soul, an actor without direction, or an audience. On April 11th, Lincoln delivers a victory speech outside the White House. Booth is in the crowd with Harold. He is fuming, and still trying to make sense of this world he hoped he would prevent from coming into existence. When he hears Lincoln suggest that the formerly enslaved will be given to the right to vote, he snaps. The right to vote means citizenship, a privilege Booth cannot tolerate for people he believes belong in slavery. He pushes through the crowd and mutters, "Now by God I'll put him through." For Booth, it's the final straw. Over the next few days, Booth visits a number of theaters in Washington, D.C., asking if Lincoln is expected to attend any performances. As the Capitol celebrates, Booth informs his co-conspirators that their objective has changed. Booth will kill the president. And there is more. Pointing to each collaborator, he explains, "Atzerodt will kill Vice President Johnson, while the others take out Secretary of State Seward. If abducting Lincoln no longer serves any use, then coordinated multiple attacks on his government will show them the fight is not yet over." Atzerodt bolts. He isn't a killer. Booth makes it clear he has no choice. He's gathered enough evidence to prove Atzerodt's involvement in the plot to abduct the president. He's already a dead man. This proclamation silences dissent, and the others fall into line. All they need now is the right moment. That moment arrives on April 14th at Ford's Theater. It's April 14th, 1865, the night President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. The civil war that has ravaged the country since 1861 is finally coming to an end, with Northern Union forces to clear victors. Just 5 days earlier, Confederate General Robert E. Lee abandoned Petersburg and surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. It marked one of the final battles of the American Civil War. The country will stay as one, with southern states ineffectively seeking secession having no choice but to accept defeat. In Washington, D.C., residents of the city, politicians, and visitors sigh a collective breath of relief. They can start to look at a future not marked by the death of their sons and the toll of war, but by prosperity and stability under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, the president who secured victory for the North. The air around the Capitol is throbbing with the rush of victory. The whole city is in a festive mood. Buildings are illuminated with gas jets and the shape of stars and eagles, or words such as peace and victory. Union soldiers are out in force, proudly wearing their dark blue uniforms as they walk down the city streets. People visiting the Capitol from across America crawl from one bar to another, singing victory songs and looking for another party to join. Theaters are packed with people determined to put the hell of war behind them and return to normality. None more so than Ford's Theater on 10th Street. Earlier that day, a notice appeared in the Evening Star announcing that President Abraham Lincoln will be attending Ford's to watch the performance of My American Cousin, along with his wife Mary Todd Lincoln, and the hero of the hour, General Ulysses S. Grant himself. Tickets sell fast, and at the 8 o'clock curtain, the seats are filled. Most are there to catch a glimpse of the president and General Grant, rather than watch the actual play, of course. President Lincoln's usual box is on the right-hand side of the theater, directly above the stage. It's decorated with the American flag, signaling his presence. A large walnut rocking chair has been placed in the box for him, alongside other seating for his wife, General Grant. Only, General was not there, much to the disappointment of the crowd. He took a train home to Burlington, New Jersey earlier in the afternoon, and in his place, friends of the Lincolns, Clara Harris and her fiancé, attend instead. The Lincoln party arrives late to the theater, and as they make their way to their box, the play is interrupted. The audience gives a standing ovation, and the orchestra strikes up the patriotic song, Hail to Our Chief.
This episode is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. If you're hiring, you probably know how challenging the hiring process is, especially when you're trying to find someone who will be a great fit for the role and the company. But whether you're looking for a civil engineer, attorney, accountant, nurse, zoologist, or even a new mascot, ZipRecruiter can help you find qualified candidates fast. And right now you can try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/crime. So, how does it work? Well, whatever role you're hiring for, ZipRecruiter's matching technology finds people with the right experience for your job and presents them to you. Then you can invite your top choices to apply. It's so effective that 4 out of 5 employers get a quality candidate within the first day. Remember, right now you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/crime. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/CRIME. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
I do apologize for interrupting your amateur detective time. I'm the famous Holmes detective. No, not that one. Enola Holmes. I opened my own detective agency, which is not going as well as I expected. If you're listening to this, you've got an eye for mystery and a thirst for cracking tough cases. A new game is afoot, and a mystery of this size takes 2 Holmes to handle. Yes, my brother, Sherlock, will be along for the ride. Soon I will be worthy of the Holmes name. As a super sleuth yourself, join me on a mystery of historic proportions as we unpack every twist and turn.
Enola Holmes 2 debuts November 4th, only on Netflix, rated PG-13. Click or tap the banner below to learn more.
The whole theater sings along, ecstatic in triumph and hope, overcome by the presence of the father of this new nation. Ford's Theater intends to close the evening with another patriotic song, Honor to Our Soldiers, written especially for the occasion. But they will never get to the end of the play. What will unfold at Ford's Theater that night will send shockwaves through America. Washington, D.C., only hours earlier reveling in a post-war high, plunges into its deepest and darkest fears. In the immediate aftermath, chaos rules and opportunists looking for a souvenir ransack Fords. Rumors ebb and swell, sending entire neighborhoods into panic. As a team of the best doctors witness the president's every gasping breath while wondering if it will be his last. Many question if the new nation they imagined has been caught in the claws of a resistance movement that will destroy the ideals it is built on. Lincoln is relieved as everyone else that the war is over.
What the fuck?
The responsibility is a heavy burden for any president to bear.
Yes.
Evening at one of his favorite theaters with his adoring wife must feel like an escape of sorts, but he doesn't know what is about to unfold. Lincoln slowly makes his way through the dress circle of Ford's theater, greeted by the applause, cheers, and whoops of the crowd. He enters his box with his wife and guests and sits in the rocking chair, partly concealed behind a flag. The audience settles down, takes their seats, and everyone's attention is drawn to the stage. Many are more interested in what might be happening in the president's box than the performance itself. Abraham Lincoln, a war president known for his rousing speeches and keeping the Union together, is without a doubt the main attraction of the evening. The play Our American Cousin is a popular British comedy that dates back to the 1850s. It tells the story of an aristocratic English family desperate to stay in the good graces of an American relative, Asa, played by Harry Hawk. He has just inherited the family fortune.
Do you remember when I used to call myself Harry Hawk yesterday? I used to walk around the door, I'm Harry Hawk. I'm Harry Hawk, and I'd be like, hey, Harry Hawk, and I'd be like, hi, everyone, and they'd be like, hey, I'm like, hey, Farrell, here, hi, hey, Farrell, hi, Farrell, hey, I'm Harry Hawk.
As the evening progresses, the audience notes the reactions in the president's box. In particular, Mary Lincoln sits next to her husband and is especially pleased to be there. She smiles throughout while glancing at her beloved husband. By 10:15 p.m., the play is in full swing, and Act 2 reveals that the American relative hasn't inherited a fortune as previously thought. The audience is as incredulous as the cast. In the dress circle, James P. Ferguson sits in a seat with a clear view of the president's box. He owns a saloon next door to Ford's Theater and makes a point of attending whenever the president is present. This evening, he is desperate to catch a glimpse of General Grant, and borrows his girlfriend's opera glasses to keep a watch on the box in case Grant makes a last-minute appearance. As the play enters its final act, Ferguson notices a well-groomed man with a large black mustache inching his way to the president's box. He recognizes him immediately. As a regular at the theaters of Washington, D.C., he knows the actor John Wilkes Booth when he sees him. Booth stops near the entrance of the box, with his hat in his hand, and looks around. Harry Ford, the theater owner, is in the box office checking sales receipts. On stage, the actor Hawk delivers an ominous cutting line. Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out. Old gal, you sock-dologizing old man-trap. The audience erupts into a roar of laughter, interrupted by a singular loud pop sound. Startled, Hawk spins around and sees a commotion in the president's box. From the box, he sees Booth leap over the balustrade and drop to the stage, injuring his leg as he lands. In the box office, Ford hears it too. He turns to his colleague, confused. That was not in the piece, he comments. Ford rushes to the window that looks onto the stage and sees Booth, also familiar to him. Standing, Booth raises a dagger over his head and shouts, "The South shall be free!" And then a blood-curdling scream coming from the president's box engulfs the entire theater. The cast of My American Cousin, still on stage and spellbound by the commotion, snap out of their shock and flee backstage. The audience, realizing this is not part of the performance and something terrible has happened in the president's box, breaks out in panic. A stampede seems inevitable as people rush to the exits and husbands lift their wives onto the stage to keep them safe. Hordes of people hurry to the president's box, fighting to get in. Some climb the balustrade and jump into it. In the chaos, no one thinks to stop the man responsible. Booth flees into the wings, making his escape. It's 1877. St. Helen tells his friend Bates that he is John Wilkes Booth, President Lincoln's assassin, before losing consciousness. Bates may never hear the rest of the story. The doctor informs him St. Helen won't make it through the night. Bates waits by his friend's bedside for the final breath. At the very least, St. Helen, John Wilkes Booth, whoever he is, won't die alone out in the wilderness. Can the man he has known as John St. Helen all these years really be John Wilkes Booth? If he is, then who was the man killed at the Garrett farm on April 26, 1865? How did Booth allegedly escape the clutches of the Federal Army and manage to live out his life undetected? Bates is desperate for his friend to survive. He rubs brandy over St. Helen's body, hoping to revitalize him. And then he leaves. Next week on Deathbed Confessions, we conclude our story of John Wilkes Booth and the mysterious man who claimed to be him while lying on his deathbed. We dive into the alternate theory of Booth's escape from justice that captivated the American imagination, and follow the strange afterlife of the man claiming to be Booth's body as it tours the country. That's next week. Deathbed Confessions is a Spotify original from Parcast, produced in partnership with Noiser. Executive produced by Max Cutler, Drew Cole, and Pascal Hughes. Developed by Julian Poirot for Parcast. Series produced by Addison Nugent. Written by Saida Ruiz. Supervising editor Derek Jennings. Sound supervisor Tom Pink. Edited by Rob Plummer. Music by Oliver Baines and Dory McCauley. Sound design by Matias Torres Soler. Mix master by Kian Ryan Morgan.
Walt Disney had a gift for storytelling that resonated with audiences. From a puppet who wanted to become a real boy to a mermaid who yearned to be part of the human world, Disney has developed relatable and unforgettable characters. Hi, it's Alistair from Parcast. Join me for Once Upon a Time, a special collection of Parcast episodes celebrating the original Imagineer himself, as well as the origins of Disney's most iconic characters and stories. Follow the Spotify original from Parcast, Once Upon a Time, and catch new episodes Mondays, free and only on Spotify.
Okay. Josh, ready to big down?
Since the
Can I do this
1980s,
one?
government deregulation has led to an increase in American corporate power. Today, enormous business empires touch the daily lives of most people on the planet.
To some, the heads of these companies are entrepreneurial capitalists. They provide competitive jobs to workers and bolster the economy.
But to others, they are like dictatorial leaders who exploit workers to feed their wealth and power.
CEOs may not hold power through the state, but often their methods still resemble tyranny.
That was never more obvious than in the first generation of American capitalist tycoons who seized their power out of the bloody chaos of the Civil War.
These men were ruthless, brutal, and flagrant power brokers.
Josh.
They built endlessly multiplying fortunes at any cost.
And in the process of grasping an entire nation's wealth for themselves, they earned their title, robber barons.
This is for the ones who, the girls who like to keep the D up inside, you know. He's trying to kill his kid, I'm telling you.
Welcome to Dictators, a Spotify original from Parcast. I'm Richard.
And I'm Kate. You can find all episodes of Dictators and all other Spotify originals from Parcast free on Spotify.
This season, we're exploring the Gilded Age, when the first American robber barons rose to power. Unlike most traditional dictators, these tyrants used financial power to control the lives of workers and create lasting inequality in the U.S.
This week, we'll dive into how unprecedented economic expansion was made possible and how U.S. industrial empires evolved into capitalist dictatorships.
Next week, we'll explore the life of one of the era's most notorious robber barons, Andrew Carnegie. An immigrant from Scotland, Carnegie was a prime example of the American dream,
rising from poverty to build a steel empire. But building his kingdom came at a steep, violent price. Not for Carnegie, but for the workers that made it all possible.
We'll head to 19th century America right after this. This episode of Dictators is sponsored by BetterHelp. Look, there are times when it's hard to keep your brain in problem-solving mode, and you just need someone in your corner, someone to help you work through things. A therapist can help you figure out what's causing you to feel the way you do, and they can help you figure out a solution so you can accomplish your goals, no matter how big or small they are. If you're thinking of giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is a great option. It's convenient, accessible, affordable, and it's entirely online. All you have to do is fill out a short survey, and you'll be matched with a licensed therapist that you can talk with via video, phone, or chat. Plus, you can easily switch therapists at any time. If you want to be a better problem solver, BetterHelp can help you get there. And right now, listeners can get 10% off their first month of therapy at betterhelp.com/parcast. That's betterhelp.com/parcast.
I do apologize for interrupting your amateur detective time. A new game is afoot, and a mystery of this size takes 2 homes to handle. Yes, my brother, Sherlock, will be along for the ride. As a super sleuth yourself, join me on a mystery of historic proportions as we unpack every twist and turn. Enola Holmes 2 debuts November 4th, only on Netflix, rated PG-13. Click or tap the banner below to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by True Classic. Men can't stop raving about True Classic's ultra soft tee designed to flatter all body types. And now with their new activewear, you can take them on those challenging workouts. The active tee is moisture wicking and odor resistant. Plus,
Remember when everybody was like, hey, exciting quantity, there's exciting quantity content, and come.
Go to trueclassic.com today and use the promo code CLASSIC for 25% off. Tap the banner or click on this episode's page to learn more.
Hey, ass, man. You're an ass. Man.
One of the most influential thinkers in American history was Thomas Jefferson.
How about your other fucking
He was
restaurant?
born during the Age of Enlightenment, when new liberal ideas challenged the despotism of absolute monarchy.
With his writings, including the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson crafted the American ideology of individual liberty.
In 1785, Jefferson expounded on that belief in a book called Notes on the State of Virginia.
Now what?
In it, he laid out an economic vision for America's future.
Jefferson hoped the United States would evolve into an agrarian society. In his view, farm laborers and small-scale property owners were the keepers of American virtue and democracy.
But Jefferson believed that 2 things threatened this future: urban industry and financial speculation. To him, this combination could destroy the independence of the American farmer. If working the land was no longer valuable, then the future of most Americans was in jeopardy.
However, after Jefferson died in 1826, the U.S. economy relied more and more on urban and corporate development. Wealth was moving out of the hands of farmers and into the pockets of businessmen with profit shares to offer.
Within 50 years of Jefferson's death, the United States entered the Gilded Age, and for many U.S. citizens, the American dream became a nightmare.
Broadly speaking, the Gilded Age refers to the period in American history between 1865 and 1900.
From the end of the Civil War to the turn of the 20th century, the United States experienced huge waves of industrialization and immigration. This influx of labor and capital set the U.S. on course to become a global superpower.
During this period, more wealth was accumulated by Americans than ever before. Whereas fortunes were typically made from annual harvests or the ownership of land and plantations that relied on enslaved labor, now a select few Americans could rise through the ranks in a factory or turn a small stock investment into a bonanza.
Massive industrialization created new companies overnight, and those companies generated profits. Profits led to more industrial investments, and the cycle continued. The speed of this industrial growth was unprecedented.
And it all began with a simple act of theft.
Starting in the mid to late 1700s, Great Britain developed innovative techniques to increase textile production. Along with the emergence of steam power, new machines allowed workers to make cloth faster and cheaper.
Samuel Slater, a British industrialist, and Francis Cabot Lowell, an American tourist in Britain, both realized they could make a killing if they got these processes over to the U.S. So they memorized proprietary British machine designs and copied them in the northern United States.
In 1793, Slater created the first water-powered cotton mill. 2 decades later, Lowell expanded on Slater's work by creating a large factory based around a new power loom.
These systems were replicated across New England, bringing textiles to the forefront of America's northern economy.
But textiles weren't the only industry to benefit from new innovations. American inventors also turned their attention to guns.
In the early 19th century, firearms were created by hand. It was a laborious task, even for a skilled gunsmith, and it could take months to fill a government weapons contract.
Worse yet, because the guns were handcrafted, no two were identical. So if one suddenly broke, a soldier couldn't repair it by taking parts from a spare gun. This could have deadly consequences in a battle.
It was also dangerous on the western edges of the United States, where settlers often conducted their own vigilante justice,
I was
and
the only kid
shootouts
they
were
ever met
frequent.
who would say by 36 to
Several
get 2 divorces.
industrialists realized that it would be easier, faster, and cheaper to create
And I was 18
interchangeable
that I would say
parts
that.
for
Why?
guns.
Because I
One
just
of the
figured
first inventors to make it happen was
I would get
gunsmith
attached
John
to someone
Hall.
or something.
In 1819, Hall accepted a government contract for 1,000 guns.
But it was kind of
For
like
the
a
next
mature
5
thing to say.
years, Hall meticulously designed a new rifle, but he also created precise machines to make the rifle's parts.
In 1824, Hall presented his rifles for government inspection. The review lasted 2 years, and 200 guns were disassembled and their parts were mixed up. The rifles were reassembled with random parts from the pile, and not a single one failed to fire.
After Hall, interchangeable parts became the bedrock of American manufacturing. Machines made parts, and workers combined the parts into products. With the adoption of the assembly line, a new era truly began, the era of mass production.
The techniques used to produce interchangeable firearms were applied to the construction of ships, clocks, sewing machines, and eventually large-scale harvesting equipment. Essentially,
Do you
we
remember
could
when
say
it used
that
to be called
American
large-scale
manufacturing
harvesting equipment?
was founded
Oh yeah, my friends would
on
always be like,
guns.
oh look, it's large-scale
However, the
harvesting
new wave
equipment.
of
And I'd
mass
be like,
production brought new
hi
problems,
friends, thank you for calling me
like
by my well-known
illumination.
nickname.
Up
They were
until
like,
the
oh, no problem,
mid-19th
large-scale
century, lighting
harvesting
options were
equipment.
limited. Before electricity, people mostly worked during daylight.
But with the rise of American manufacturing, factory owners didn't want their profits limited by sunlight. They demanded long hours, meaning work stretched into the darkness of night.
The factories needed light.
At the time, the most common options were whale oil, coal, or open flames like candles or hearths. But in the 1850s, whale oil prices skyrocketed due to overhunting. Meanwhile, coal was inefficient and open flames were too dangerous for most factories.
So industrialists turned to a new product, Petroleum.
Until the mid-19th century, petroleum, or rock oil, was mostly considered useless. However, in 1853, industrialist George Bissell began to wonder if this flammable rock oil could be used for some practical purposes.
Bissell gathered a group of investors and had crude petroleum tested by a chemist to prove it could be refined into a fuel source. With those results in hand, he formed a company devoted to petroleum production.
Bissell's new company sent a group to an area in Pennsylvania called Oil Creek, where they searched for a consistent supply of petroleum.
On August 27, 1859, the crew struck a massive deposit of the black liquid.
Bissell immediately bought up the surrounding land, sunk a number of wells, and installed pumps to bring up the oil. Within 18 months, he had 75 operational wells and became the world's first oil baron.
Petroleum provided light for factories and rural communities alike. However, inventors found that oil could be used for even more than illumination.
Remember this
It could
one,
also
where
be
it's at
used for machine
36-37?
lubrication.
Then it stopped.
And in the late 1800s, there was one machine that needed more lubrication than any other: the locomotive engine.
Shout out to
In
Maroni.
the 1820s, when it came to powering engines, advances in steam engine technology fully replaced horsepower. From there, these steam-powered wagons made their way onto metal rails, where they could move even faster. Thus, the railroad was born.
Throughout the 1830s, rail lines were constructed up and down the East Coast. By the 1850s, trains were the primary method of transporting goods along the eastern seaboard.
With such widespread success, some businessmen began to wonder if it was possible to build rails across the entire continent.
If a railroad accessed the seemingly endless resources of the West, there was no limit to the profit that could be made.
Asa Whitney proposed the first transcontinental railroad to Congress in 1845. A few years later, interest in a Pacific railroad skyrocketed when gold was discovered in California.
Throughout the 1850s, government surveyors looked for viable routes across the country. This sparked contentious debates among politicians in Washington. After all, the railroad promised to bring revenue wherever it went, and every politician wanted that revenue for his state.
Northern politicians didn't want the route through southern states, and vice versa. This led to political deadlock, and by the end of the 1850s, it seemed the Transcontinental Railroad was likely doomed.
However, an engineer named Theodore Judah was obsessed with linking the two coasts and refused to take no for an answer. If the government couldn't make it happen, he would.
Judah knew that by building the Transcontinental Railroad, he could etch his name into the annals of history and make a fortune.
But Judah didn't know that his obsession would also help end a political standstill.
Coming up, the Civil War divides the nation and creates an economic boom.
The most urgent mysteries in the world are missing persons cases. The stakes are too high not to pursue every plausible possibility, and some implausible ones too. I'm Sarah Turney, host of the new podcast, Disappearances. In 2020, after spending years searching for the truth, I used social media to help bring justice to my sister Alyssa's nearly 2 decades-long disappearance. Now, every Thursday on Spotify, I'm exploring the many reasons people disappear and the impact their absences can have on those left behind. From child abductions and mystifying murders to those who took drastic measures to start over, each episode of Disappearances journeys through a different high-profile missing persons case, ripped from the headlines and ripe for explanation. Because no one just vanishes into thin air. The answers are out there, waiting to be found. Follow the Spotify original from Parcast, Disappearances. Hear a new episode every Thursday, free and only on Spotify.
What was this?
This episode is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. If you're hiring, you probably know how challenging the hiring process is, especially when you're trying to find someone who will be a great fit for the role and the company. But whether you're looking for a civil engineer, attorney, accountant, nurse, zoologist, or even a new mascot, ZipRecruiter can help you find qualified candidates fast. And right now you can try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/crime. So, how does it work? Well, whatever role you're hiring for, ZipRecruiter's matching technology finds people with the right experience for your job and presents them to you. Then you can invite your top choices to apply. It's so effective that 4 out of 5 employers get a quality candidate within the first day. Remember, right now you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/crime. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/CRIME. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
Now back to the story.
Throughout the early 1800s, the United States economy changed drastically. Innovations in manufacturing, the discovery of petroleum, and the development of steam locomotives set the stage for the young country to become a strong, prosperous nation.
But by mid-century, growing tensions between northern and southern states brought that growth to a grinding halt. The dream of a transcontinental railroad, which would bring untold resources and wealth, fell into political limbo.
However, engineer Theodore Judah was determined to bring the project to fruition, even if it meant sharing the wealth.
In 1860, Judah convinced 4 major California businessmen, including Leland Stanford, to invest in his railroad project. Recognizing the fortune to be made, they joined him to create the Central Pacific Railroad Company.
Their timing was perfect, even if it seemed terrible. That same year, Northerner Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, and the southern states began seceding from the Union. And after decades of tension between the northern and southern states over the issue of slavery, the country descended into a bloody civil war in April 1861.
For most Americans, this was a dangerous, uncertain time, characterized by violence, blood, and the potential dissolution of the country.
But for the railroad industrialists, it was a golden opportunity.
With a suitcase full of investor money, Judah and Stanford went to Washington to lobby for federal construction loans. They doled out bribes to politicians to make sure they got a piece of the government's war funding.
Come on, baby.
And they weren't the only
Come on, baby.
Thomas Durant, another regional railroad baron, also saw the Civil War as a cash grab. Like Judah and Stanford, Durant handed out bribes to entice congressmen to support his own railroad project.
Though the bribery was greatly appreciated, it wasn't exactly necessary. The war itself was already proving that a national rail system was vital. It would save time sending troops and supplies to distant battlefields, and it could also become a symbol of unity for a divided nation.
So in 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act, which authorized funding for the first transcontinental railroad. The Central Pacific Line would stretch eastward from Sacramento, while the Union Pacific would start in Omaha, Nebraska, and head west. Both lines would link up in the middle of the country.
Construction began in early 1863.
The Central Pacific faced the daunting task of cutting through the Sierra Nevada mountain range. The vast majority of this dangerous work was performed by Chinese immigrants. They used volatile explosives to blast through rock, which led to untold injury and death.
Meanwhile, the Union Pacific mostly employed Irish immigrants or Civil War veterans. These workers suffered from terrible weather and unreliable supplies.
But the workers' injuries and strife meant little to the investors pushing the project to completion.
Their profits relied on joining the railroads and running trains, not worrying about their workers.
Finally, on May 10, 1869, the two rail lines met at Promontory, Utah, completing one of the most ambitious public works projects in U.S. history.
After 6 arduous years, the American frontier was now open for business, and railroad owners across the country saw the profits roll in.
As the country slowly healed from the Civil War, people and products poured into the American West and growing urban centers. Oil, cattle, steel, mining, timber, and whiskey all saw their businesses expand.
Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862, giving 160 acres of western land to settlers for free for 5 years. This westward expansion invigorated the economy. New western towns sprung up. Those towns needed supplies.
Meanwhile, in the country's cities, a new wave of European immigrants joined the urban workforce.
Just always open the right
Factories
spots.
quickly
Just like a fucking
expanded as the
one of
sudden
those Shabbos
population
elevators.
growth
Fuck
created
yeah.
a new demand for various goods.
As these companies grew, so did the nature of
Okay, are you
American
done now?
capitalism.
Okay, Yoshi. Oh,
The
and then
industrial boom led to the rise of the corporation.
Prior to the Gilded Age, most business enterprises were small and local. These companies rarely employed over 100 people.
In contrast, much larger companies, or corporations, had several advantages. They could survive even if a founder died or was ousted by the other partners. They could also merge with other corporations, leading to bigger conglomerates and trusts.
According to author John Steele Gordon, the corporation was a primary reason the railroad
Once the
industry grew so
corporation
quickly.
began,
Initially, railroad companies were local functions which operated small transportation lines. However, as the industry expanded, these local rail companies merged to form corporations.
These mergers created a new standard of business and businessmen.
While small business owners had personal ties to their workers and the communities they served, the leaders of corporations were much farther away physically and existentially.
Perhaps as a result, they were much more cutthroat and ruthless.
All that mattered was gaining profit.
With a little time, this attitude edged out competition and ultimately led to just a few men controlling the majority of the nation's rail lines.
From there, the corporation boom spread to other industries.
Oil baron John D. Rockefeller and steel magnate Andrew Carnegie saw the value of mergers and acquisitions. They also aggressively squeezed out their competition.
As the Gilded Age continued, the best part of all major industries were controlled by a small group of men, including railroads, oil, and steel.
Which meant most of the American economy was in their hands.
These robber barons, like Stanford, Carnegie, and Rockefeller, were able to create vast monopolies because there were no rules to stop them. No one expected American industries to grow so big so fast. Until the Gilded Age, there was no need for corporate regulation.
In fact, America's entire financial system, including the stock market and banking, was mostly unregulated. And tycoons used the lack of legal oversight to their advantage, often with dire consequences for ordinary Americans.
None was more ruthless than railroad magnate Jay Gould.
Gould spent most of his career trying to work the financial sector to his advantage. When he made up his mind that he wanted something, he stopped at nothing to get it, no matter who he had to bribe or bankrupt along the way.
Gould also had a trusted business partner named Jim Fisk, who was a bit less cutthroat than Gould. Still, that didn't stop the two partners from becoming the major transporters of wheat in the Midwest.
However, the value of wheat wasn't just in the domestic market. There was vast profit in shipping crops to Europe. And Gould and Fisk knew there had to be a way they could encourage the growth of that international market and thus increase their profits.
They found their solution in the way wheat was paid for.
Gold was used for international transactions because its value was usually stable, unlike paper currency, which fluctuated due to inflation.
However, the price of gold did fluctuate occasionally. When it went up, Europeans could buy more wheat with their gold.
Gould realized if he and Fisk could raise the price of gold, then it would entice international investors to buy American wheat, which would be transported on their railroads.
Only one thing stood in their way: the U.S. government. It held the largest amount of gold bullion in the country. If the government caught wind that someone was manipulating the gold market, then it could sell federal gold to drive prices back down and bust Gould's plan.
To prevent this, Gould got in contact with his friend Abel Corbin. Corbin's brother-in-law happened to be the newly elected president, Ulysses.
And during the summer of 1869, Gould casually convinced Grant not to sell any of the government's gold. By September, Grant didn't plan on selling U.S. gold during that fall.
It was the moment Gould had been waiting for. He and Fisk started buying up huge amounts of gold. With this increased demand, the price of gold steadily rose in the U.S. throughout September 1869.
It peaked on September 24th. When the commodities market opened that day, the price of gold jumped from $143 to $150. Just before noon, it reached $160, an unheard of amount for that time.
Gould and Fisk's plan didn't quite pan out, though. Before the high gold values could affect the international wheat market, President Grant realized he'd been conned. He immediately ordered the Treasury to sell $4 million worth of gold to push the price back down.
It had the intended effect. The price quickly fell back to $133.
But not before Gould and Fisk sold off the gold shares they'd accumulated in the previous weeks at an enormous profit.
For the speculators, the wheat sales plan may have flopped, but they came out on top anyway.
Not so much for the thousands of other investors who were duped into buying gold.
After the price crash, many of them were left in financial ruin, especially the ones who had purchased the gold on credit. Now they were unable to pay back their creditors.
Neither Gould nor Fisk faced any legal consequences for their actions. Both men managed to avoid federal charges, and in the process, they revealed how wealthy tycoons could destroy the fortunes of many Americans in order to satisfy their own greed without consequence.
It didn't take long for another robber baron to do it again. But this time, the greed risked the collapse of America's entire financial system.
Coming up, the Gilded Age becomes a nightmare of corruption and scandal.
This episode is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. If you're hiring, you probably know how challenging the hiring process is, especially when you're trying to find someone who will be a great fit for the role and the company. But whether you're looking for a civil engineer, an attorney, accountant, nurse, zoologist, or even a new mascot, ZipRecruiter can help you find qualified candidates fast. And right now you can try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/crime. So, how does it work? Well, whatever role you're hiring for, ZipRecruiter's matching technology finds people with the right experience for your job and presents them to you. Then you can invite your top choices to apply. It's so effective that 4 out of 5 employers get a quality candidate within the first day. Remember, right now you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/crime. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/CRIME. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
This episode is brought to you by Poise Ultra Thins. Out of the millions of women who experience bladder leaks, 7 out of 10 women are using their period pads to help stay dry. But listen up, ladies. Period pads aren't designed for PE, and you don't have to settle for subpar protection. With Poise Ultra Thins, you can feel clean, dry, and fresh all day long. Poise Ultra Thins are specifically designed for bladder leaks and keep you 10 times drier than the leading period pad. They're also super comfortable. With a fit made for your body, you'll barely know it's there, so you can live life without compromise. It takes poise. Tap the banner, click on this episode's page, or visit poise.com to learn more.
Now back to the story.
Throughout the second half of the 19th century, the United States experienced an economic boom like never before. The Transcontinental Railroad opened the frontier, and a wave of immigration expanded urban centers and fostered rapid industrialization.
With the explosion of American capitalism, much of the economy belonged to the robber barons. And with their monopolies, they could manipulate prices to make themselves richer.
However, with so much money at stake, their financial speculation could also put the entire U.S. economy at risk.
For example, on September 18, 1873, one of the nation's chief financial leaders, Jay Cooke, announced that his bank was closing its doors.
Like many bankers, Cooke had invested heavily in railroads. Unfortunately, Cooke hadn't invested in the Central or Pacific Rail, but in a competing transcontinental line that suffered a financial scandal.
Now, he was bankrupt.
When Cooke shut down his bank, the effects were dire. Railroad companies represented roughly 80% of Wall Street stocks. Because Cooke's announcement was related to the railroad, it caused a panic. Investors, especially European ones, worried his bank's collapse meant the railroads as a whole were in trouble, so they sold rail stocks en masse, and the market crashed.
The crash halted railroad construction nationwide. Banks across the country folded, and prices fell drastically on various commodities. For the next 6 years, the United States sank into a depression, all thanks to Cooke's poor investments.
But not everyone suffered. While many businesses collapsed after the 1873 crash, some wealthy robber barons actually got richer.
Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, the Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt families took advantage of the Depression. They used their business empires to buy out weakened competitors. They leveraged their monopolies to control market prices, and they made more profit than before the crash.
And while the rest of the country was in an economic downturn, these rich families flaunted their wealth. The Vanderbilts built audacious mansions, including a 70-room summer home and a 250-room chateau called the Biltmore.
A good number of these elites, including Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Rockefeller, also showed off their wealth through philanthropy. They helped establish universities, public libraries, and scientific institutions.
But their contributions rarely helped the workers who actually built and maintained their business empires. Most Gilded Age capitalists squeezed as much profit from their employees as possible, even if it cost lives.
Working conditions were extremely dangerous during this period. For example, coal and copper miners faced cave-ins, floods, toxic gas leaks, and fires. Steel workers operated heavy machinery with open furnaces and molten steel. Workplace injuries were constant, and deaths were common.
Meanwhile, an injured worker could be easily replaced from the vast pool of immigrant labor. This led to a rise in American prejudice against recent immigrants, specifically Italian, Jewish, and Chinese immigrants.
And since there were no minimum wage laws, robber barons could pay whatever they wanted. Some jobs only paid $1.25 for a 12-hour shift.
Workers' living conditions were also horrible. In the overcrowded cities, factory workers often had to live in tenements. These apartments were small and packed in as many people as possible. On top
top of that, sanitation and heating were non-existent.
Unsurprisingly, diseases spread rapidly.
As the Gilded Age wore on, many laborers grew tired of exploitation. They formed labor unions to fight back with strikes and boycotts, creating one of the first labor movements in the United States.
According to journalist Michael Hiltzik, a railroad strike at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad on July 16, 1877, ushered in a new era of labor rights. This strike spread throughout the region, and roughly 1 million railroad workers stood in solidarity.
However, President Rutherford B. Hayes, a supporter of big business and friend to many robber barons, sent federal troops to quash the protests. The strike ended.
Still, it inspired the working class across America to form their own unions and strike back.
For example, in 1881, predominantly black washerwomen struck in Atlanta. Miners in Tennessee took up arms at Cold Creek in 1891. Steelworkers at Carnegie's Homestead plant fought on the picket lines in 1892. And in 1894, factory workers struck and boycotted the Pullman Train Car Company.
The reason so many strikes were necessary was because the robber barons could end them quickly and brutally. They called upon the Pinkerton Detective Agency, state militias, and federal troops to help quell the uprisings. But even in the face of terrible violence, the strikes continued.
And they worked. People started to criticize the robber barons. In reporting on the widespread strikes, journalists increasingly exposed corruption among the rich and powerful. Their articles revealed how tycoons used their businesses to embezzle federal funds and secure political favors.
Meanwhile, in 1890, photojournalist Jacob Riis published How the Other Half Lives. His photographs showed the reality of life in the nation's tenements and highlighted the working class's horrible living conditions in New York's slums.
Throughout the 1890s, this style of investigative journalism, called muckraking, chipped away at the monopolistic power of the robber barons.
Until, in 1904, journalist Ida Tarbell published a book called The History of Standard Oil Company. Originally serialized in McClure's magazine, this deep dive into John D. Rockefeller's company showed that Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act.
The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890 to prevent large monopolies. However, it was rarely enforced, so conglomerates like the Standard Oil Company, U.S. Steel, and the American Tobacco Company thrived without oversight.
But in the wake of Tarbell's discoveries, President Theodore Roosevelt, a self-proclaimed trust buster, ordered an investigation into Rockefeller and his company.
Just 4 years later, in 1906, the government filed a suit against the oil company. In the end, Standard Oil was forced to break up into multiple entities.
And that was merely the beginning. By the late 1900s, public outrage over corruption and inequality ushered in the progressive era.
In this period, social reforms like ending child labor, the 8-hour workday, and women's suffrage put economic power back into the hands of the workers.
The robber barons were no longer in control of the American economy, and the Gilded Age was over.
It's notable that this whirlwind era of industrialization and monopolistic wealth wasn't known as the Golden Age, but the Gilded Age. Gilding is the process of placing a very thin layer of gold on something for decorative purposes. The term implies applying a superficial shine in order to disguise a shoddy situation.
Mark Twain is credited with popularizing the term in his 1873 satire, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. Twain could see that American prosperity was a sham. Just beneath the surface of wealth and prosperity for the robber barons, the rest of America was suffering.
For 35 years or so, industrial tycoons held the real power in the United States. Their enormous wealth bought them whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted it. Cornelius Vanderbilt perfectly summed up the mindset of the robber barons when he reportedly exclaimed, quote, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?"
Vanderbilt was right. He, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Henry Ford ran the industry of the nation, and in many ways, the nation itself.
Next week, we'll explore the life of Steel Baron and
You can find all episodes of Dictators and all other Spotify originals from Spotify.
we'll see you next time.
Dictators is a Spotify original from Parcast. It is executive produced by Max Cutler, sound designed by Anthony Valsic, with production assistance by Ron Shapiro, Trent Williamson, Carly. Dictators with Tate.
I'm Sarah Turney, host of the new Spotify original from Park Appearances. Every Thursday, join me for an exploration into history's most gripping missing persons cases. Following timelines, analyzing clues, and piecing together as many answers as possible to find the truth. From prison breaks and child abductions to second chances and even murder. We'll journey through the many reasons people disappear. Follow my new podcast, Disappearances, free and only on Spotify.
This episode is brought to you by Buffalo Trace Distillery. Everyone knows how good Buffalo Trace is, but did you know, while you're sipping whiskeys from the world's most award-winning distillery, you could also be listening to their new Trace Talk podcast. It features discussions with celebrities and explores everything you need to know about Buffalo Trace and bourbon. So tune into Buffalo Trace Distillery's Trace Talk podcast, and to learn more, tap the banner Buffalo Trace Distillery, Franklin County, Kentucky. Please drink responsibly.
This episode is brought to you by ADD. It's time for the greatest mystery of all. Who keeps knocking the planters over on your front porch? Because you have ADD and their smart home security systems with Google Nest, the answer is pretty easy to figure out. The Google Nest doorbell lets you know what's happening at your front door from virtually anywhere. And the bird, turns out, it's a human stray cat. Help protect what matters most with all the smart devices you need, plus 24/7 professional monitoring from ADD, and a little help from Google. To see how ADD can help make your home smarter and safer, visit ADD.com.
In early July 1892, 56-year-old steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie was enjoying a vacation in Scotland with his wife Louise. As a Scotsman who emigrated to the United States in poverty, Carnegie may have looked like he was simply visiting the homeland to flaunt his hard-earned wealth.
In fact, he was also dodging a major issue with his business. At the Homestead Steel Mill, workers were preparing to strike. His company had hired 300 men to break the strike, and Carnegie did not want to be around for what happened next. On July 6th, steel workers clashed with the company's agents. Both sides were armed. By the time the battle ended, at least 10 people lay dead.
When asked to comment on the tragedy, Carnegie pointed to the fact that he'd left his business partner, Henry Clay Frick, in charge of the whole affair. He said, quote, "I have given up all active control."
Of course, Carnegie knew exactly who Frick was, exactly the kinds of methods he'd rely on to deal with the strikers. His absence just gave him the convenient excuse of plausible deniability.
But in the end, the schemes all pointed toward one truth.
For Carnegie, all that mattered was crushing any obstacle between him and profit, even if that meant a trail of blood on the factory floor.
Welcome to Dictators, a Spotify original from Parcast. I'm Richard.
And I'm Kate. You can find all episodes of Dictators and all other Spotify originals from Parcast free on Spotify.
This season, we're exploring the Gilded Age, when the first American robber barons rose to power.
Unlike most traditional dictators, these tyrants used financial power to control the lives of workers and create lasting inequality in the U.S.
This week, we'll explore the life of one of the most prominent robber barons of the era, Andrew Carnegie. An immigrant from Scotland, Carnegie personified the quintessential tale of rags to riches. But in building his empire of steel, he made a deal with the devil, pitting himself and his profits against the workers that made it all possible.
We'll head to Scotland right after this. The United States was founded on liberal ideals. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Men, at least white landowning ones, were created equal, and no government should get in the way of success.
It was an inspiring message for immigrants coming from the rigid social hierarchies of Europe. America belonged to them. It was a place where no matter who you were born as, you could turn yourself into a man of fortune.
No one made this promise look truer than Andrew Carnegie.
Unfortunately, in the process of accumulating his unbelievable hoards of power and wealth, Carnegie forgot his humble roots.
Born in autumn of 1835, Carnegie and his family lived in the Scottish town of Dunfermline near Edinburgh.
According to historian David Nassau, Dunfermline was already in 1835 an epicenter for the Industrial Revolution. During the first half of the 19th century, the town was economically prosperous, especially when it came to textiles.
Carnegie's father, William, was a handloom weaver, and by the time Andrew was born, a moderately prosperous one.
But success didn't last. In 1837, the U.S. suddenly found itself in an economic depression, which reverberated to Scotland. As poverty struck in America, the demand for fine linens diminished. By September 1837, over 1,000 handloom weavers in Dunfermline were out of work or on strike.
William Carnegie was hit hard by the sudden downturn in demand. Even worse, he refused to adapt and find a new way to make a living. By most accounts, William was lazy. Though he was considered a decent chap and good churchman, he also had a poor work ethic.
As a result, young Andrew seemingly grew to resent his father. Instead, he looked to someone else for inspiration, his mother, Margaret.
By the 1840s, Margaret Carnegie took charge of the family's financial survival. She not only helped her brother in his cobbler shop, but also began a small business selling baked goods and other groceries.
Margaret was tough and diligent, and something of a taskmaster. She had to be. She made sure she ingrained the value of hard work in Andrew and her younger son, Tom.
Andrew took to the lessons immediately. In between schooling, 10-year-old Andrew helped out his mother by running errands, bookkeeping, and working the counter at her small store.
Still, despite their best efforts, the family continued to toil in near poverty.
Margaret Carnegie decided the only solution was a change, and a big one. America.
So, in 1848, 12-year-old Andrew left Dunfermline with his mother, father, and little Tom. The family sailed to the United States and eventually laid down their roots in Allegheny City, a town that would later be absorbed into Pittsburgh.
By the mid-19th century, Pittsburgh was a major industrial center. With roughly 50,000 people, the city was home to a plethora of job opportunities, including iron factories, cotton mills, and tanneries.
Working conditions were brutal, but finding a job wasn't nearly as difficult as it had been in Scotland.
Unfortunately, William Carnegie refused to provide for the family. Though he continued to make linens by hand, his pride wouldn't allow him to look for a factory job.
Once again, Margaret and Andrew became the family's breadwinners.
For the next few years, the teenaged Andrew bounced around various jobs. His first was in a weaving factory as a bobbin boy. He went from loom to loom, handing the mill girls spindles of cotton or wool. He did this for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and for only $1.20 a week. Even in 2021 dollars, that's only about $42 for 6 12-hour days.
Andrew quickly realized that success in the factory had a limit. If he really wanted to prosper, he needed to get a job in an office.
He found one as a messenger boy for the Atlantic and Ohio Telegraph Company, where he saw that the way to advance was by becoming an operator.
In order to do that, Andrew taught himself Morse code and quickly impressed his superiors with his speed and ability to fill in for sick employees. Finally, when Andrew was 15, he was promoted to operator.
From there, Andrew continued to impress the people around him, becoming one of the fastest operators in the office.
Meanwhile, working for the telegraph company exposed Andrew to the world of Pittsburgh's business class. And as his reputation as a proficient, diligent operator grew, he suddenly found businessmen seeking him out. In particular, a man named Tom Scott.
Look at these things. It's like
In 1853, Tom Scott was the superintendent for the Western Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad. His job was to oversee the line between Pittsburgh and Altoona. Unfortunately, he faced a major problem: communication.
Scott and his partners realized that to tighten up their operation, they needed to build telegraph lines along their routes, which, of course, meant they needed a private operator.
The best person
can I get one of the ones that's on the cement?
17-year-old Andrew Carnegie.
Can I get one of the ones on the
Andrew
cement?
didn't give the job offer a second thought. He recognized that railroads were the future, and the Pennsylvania Railroad in particular was on the cusp of a major expansion.
Plus, it paid more.
Unfortunately, a few years after Andrew entered the new and exciting world of railroads, tragedy struck. In October 1855, William Carnegie died of unknown causes.
Emotionally, it was a blow. And while William had never been a major source of financial help for the family, his death also heaped even more economic uncertainty on the Carnegies' plates.
Andrew was not about to let his mother bear the brunt of that. He adored her and even promised, quote, "Someday I'll be rich. We'll ride in a fine coach driven by 4 horses."
He just had to keep pushing till they got there.
Andrew remained Tom Scott's personal operator, but the position quickly evolved into Scott's personal assistant, too, which meant that Andrew got a crash course in railroad management and free.
As his teacher, Andrew learned about investing, and at the end of 1855, Scott approached Andrew with an opportunity to purchase shares of stock in Adams Express, a freight and cargo company.
Andrew was interested, but he didn't have the money. So Scott loaned him $500, and Margaret Carnegie agreed to put the family's home up as collateral. The stock purchase came with a guaranteed monthly dividend check of $10.
When that first check came in, Andrew shouted, "Eureka! Here's the goose that lays the golden eggs."
With Scott's help, Andrew realized that he didn't always have to work for his money. Rather, he could put his money to work.
Within a few years, Andrew had saved enough money to pay off the family's debts. Soon, Margaret was able to retire.
It's one of those
Never
walking
again would
sticks
she
that
have to
telescope.
toil as a cobbler's
Telescope and walking
assistant.
stick with them.
Andrew, meanwhile, continued to climb the ranks. In 1859, the 24-year-old was promoted to superintendent of the Western Division of Scott's Railroad, making an annual salary of $1,500. That's close to $50,000 in 2021 dollars.
He used the money to invest in more companies, in particular, a venture which specialized in sleeping cars. After all, Western expansion would require some comfort.
This breakneck trajectory up the Pittsburgh business ranks met an interruption in 1861, the outbreak of the Civil War. But it wasn't necessarily a bad interruption as far as Andrew Carnegie's career was concerned.
Tom Scott was named Assistant Secretary of War, and he summoned Andrew to Washington to help him coordinate the Union Army's rail system.
In particular, he needed Andrew's cut off by the rebels.
Andrew managed to accomplish this task quickly by overseeing the construction of new tracks and telegraph lines in and out of the capital. Within 4 months, the trains were running, and Andrew was back in Pittsburgh.
By the time he'd left, Andrew had learned an important lesson. He had absolutely no desire to pursue a future in politics. Politics were messy, bureaucratic, and far from the most profitable venture as far as he could tell. He'd stick to private enterprise from now on, wherever his career took him next. Because now that he was almost 26, with a government job on his resume, Andrew knew that it was time for something new.
While briefly dabbling in oil, Andrew started thinking about what was coming down the pipeline once this war ended. He was sure that westward expansion would only speed up, and there would be a major construction boom, especially with railroads.
But Andrew knew enough about railroads now to know that before you could build a track, you needed an abundance of one thing: iron.
Andrew's entry into the iron business was complicated and obtuse. His first move involved resolving a dispute between 3 feuding partners at the Cloman and Phipps Iron City Fort. Andrew's solution was to convince one of the irritable partners, a man named Tom Miller, to leave the firm. He then had his brother buy some shares from one of the other partners and join the company.
However, Andrew wasn't done. In spring of 1864, Andrew and Miller agreed to start their own iron company, which they would build 4 blocks from Cloman and Phipps.
For the first few months, the 2 iron companies battled it out. But by 1865, the competition was doing more harm than good, so they decided to merge.
In May 1865, Cloman and Phipps and Cyclops Iron became Union Iron Mills. 29-year-old Andrew Carnegie became its president, and his brother was named vice president.
This first painstakingly maneuvered merger would become the first step toward building one of the largest steel empires in the world.
Coming up, Andrew Carnegie corners steel and makes a deal with the devil.
The most urgent mysteries in the world are missing persons cases. The stakes are too high not to pursue every plausible possibility, and some implausible ones too. I'm Sarah Turney, host of the new podcast, Disappearances. In 2020, after spending years searching for the truth, I used social media to help bring justice to my sister Alyssa's nearly 2 decades-long disappearance. Now, every Thursday on Spotify, I'm exploring the many reasons people disappear and the impact their absences can have on those left behind. From child abductions and mystifying murders to those who took drastic measures to start over, each episode of Disappearances journeys through a different high-profile missing persons case, ripped from the headlines and ripe for explanation. Because no one just vanishes into thin air. The answers are out there, waiting to be found. Follow the Spotify original from Parcast, Disappearances. Hear a new episode every Thursday, free and only on Spotify.
Now back to the story.
By the end of 1865, 30-year-old Andrew Carnegie had thrown himself into the iron business. He'd succeeded in merging 2 Pittsburgh ironworks and become president of the Union Iron Mills. In the process, he laid the foundation for an empire.
A lot of Carnegie's success came from double dealing. Union Iron Mills received many of their iron contracts from another company called Keystone Bridge, which Carnegie also happened to own. And Keystone Bridge's main customer was his old employer, Pennsylvania Railroad.
Though Carnegie resigned from Pennsylvania Railroad to dedicate his time to iron, he and his mentor, Tom Scott, remained close. Scott used Keystone Bridge and by proxy Union Iron to build railways and bridges for Pennsylvania Railroad. It was no skin off his back. After all, Scott held stocks in Keystone, so everyone was making money.
Still, Carnegie yearned for more than just Pennsylvania Railroad projects.
Traveling up and down the Mississippi River, Carnegie looked for other bridge contracts. And in 1867, he won his most ambitious yet, the St. Louis Bridge.
Crossing 2,300 feet over the mighty Mississippi River, the project was one of the biggest contracts Carnegie accepted at that time. The project was estimated to cost roughly $5 million, about $93 million in 2021 dollars.
To help finance the project, Carnegie sold bonds in his company. But he didn't rely solely on American investors. After the Civil War, many European businessmen invested in the U.S., and Carnegie decided to take advantage.
In 1870, he went to London and met with an American expatriate named Julius Morgan. Morgan was a banker and financier living in London and making deals within the British markets.
He was also the father to the young financial tycoon in the making, J.P. Morgan.
Ultimately, however, the St. Louis Bridge, known today as the Eads Bridge, would prove to be a financial failure. The project fell behind schedule and didn't open until 1874. By that point, other bridges had been built, and the St. Louis Bridge became nothing more than a tourist attraction.
Carnegie, shrewd as he was, recognized that the bridge was going to be a financial disaster as early as 1871. As construction delays mounted, he and his partners decided to sell their stock in the company, saving themselves from financial ruin.
Meanwhile, although the St. Louis Bridge wasn't a financial bonanza, it did produce one major success, though it took Carnegie time to realize it.
When he first won the contract, Carnegie was forced to work with a civil engineer named James Buchanan Eads. Eads was responsible for most of the design and the construction, and he insisted on using steel, which Carnegie hated.
At the time, steel was far more expensive to produce and not nearly as strong as pure iron. Plus, there weren't nearly enough steel mills to produce the amount required to make the bridge.
However, in the summer of 1872, while on his bond-selling trip in Europe, Carnegie toured the Bessemer Steel Plant in Sheffield, England, where he witnessed the latest advances in the Bessemer process.
Invented by Henry Bessemer, the Bessemer process used giant pear-shaped converters to blast oxygen into molten iron, expelling all its impurities. As a result, the byproduct steel became not only stronger, but also cheaper and easier to produce.
After seeing the process in action, Carnegie realized that steel might not only be better than iron, but also his future. When he returned to the U.S. later that fall, he decided to go all in on steel production.
In 1873, Carnegie broke ground on the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, named after J. Edgar Thomson, the first president of Pennsylvania Railroad. Investing $250,000 of his own money at the time, Carnegie was putting all of his eggs in one basket.
The timing couldn't have been worse. In September, the Panic of 1873 sank the U.S. into a depression, which resulted in a massive halt on railroad construction. No railroads, no steel. Carnegie's new venture looked doomed from the start.
But Carnegie was not about to just give up. One of the key aspects to his success, both through the Depression and beyond, was his methodical bookkeeping. He never wanted to know the profit, but the cost of a project. This allowed him to figure out ways to make budget cuts, especially when it came to labor.
But perhaps his most consequential action during the Depression was that he constantly undercut rival companies' steel prices. As author Les Standiford writes,
While other manufacturers were charging $70 a ton for rails, Carnegie offered his for $65.
This ultimately allowed him to squeeze out the competition. And as the Depression lingered, the prices for raw materials started to fall, which meant that even at Carnegie's lowered prices, he was still making a profit.
Of course, the backbone of the business was still finding projects. In 1876, he provided the steel and iron for the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Then, 2 years later, he supplied all the steel for the Brooklyn Bridge.
While most Americans, especially trained tycoons, suffered, Andrew Carnegie thrived. In 1878, the Edgar Thomson Steelworks made a profit of more than $400,000. The following year, $512,000. And the year after that, $1.5 million. About $40 million in 2021 dollars.
The success came with just one problem: an inability to keep up with demand.
In particular, when it came to the coke ovens.
An essential ingredient to making steel is coke, a type of fuel usually made from coal, which acts as a reducing agent when smelting iron. In order to make coke, you need special ovens.
In the early days, Carnegie bought his own coke ovens. However, as his business grew, their limited capacity actually incentivized Carnegie to just buy coke on the open market.
So by 1881, Andrew Carnegie decided he would look for someone to purchase his coke ovens and find a coke supplier.
It led him directly to one of the most controversial, ruthless businessmen in America, Henry Clay Frick.
The son of moderately successful farmers, the serious Henry Clay Frick never wanted to toil on the family farm. Like Carnegie, he was a capitalist to his bones.
In 1868, Frick moved to Pittsburgh. After working desk jobs for a few years, he was unable to ignore the city's leading industries, iron and steel. However, Frick opted to enter them